Imagine waking up, reading the morning newspaper, and deciding that today is the day you are going to sell the Eiffel Tower. Not a model, not a replica, but the actual 7,000-ton iron monument standing in the center of Paris. Most people would call you insane, a lunatic belonging in an asylum, but in the spring of 1925, one man didn't just have this thought, he actually executed it. And the most terrifying part of this entire story isn't that he managed to sell the most famous landmark in the world. It's that he got away with it so cleanly that he came back and sold it a second time. This is the story of Victor Lustig, a man who possessed no royal blood, no massive fortune, and no legitimate business empire. Yet he became the undisputed king of con artists. He was a phantom wrapped in tailored suits, a master of psychology who understood that human greed was the most reliable currency on earth. To understand how a man could sell the Eiffel Tower, we must first understand the mind of the architect behind the crime. Victor Lustig was born in 1890 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a small town that sits in the modern-day Czech Republic. From an early age, he possessed an unnatural charm, an ability to make people trust him within seconds of shaking his hand. He was exceptionally intelligent, fluent in 5 languages, and possessed an elegant, aristocratic demeanor that made him appear as though he had stepped out of a European palace. But rather than using his brilliant mind for legitimate pursuits, Lustig realized early on that honest work was a slow, painful path to wealth. Why spend a lifetime building a fortune when you could simply convince someone else to hand theirs over to you with a smile? Lustig began his career on the luxurious ocean liners sailing between Paris and New York in the years before the First World War. These floating palaces were filled with wealthy, bored aristocrats and newly rich American industrialists, the perfect hunting ground for a sophisticated predator. He would dress impeccably, dining at the captain's table, presenting himself as a mysterious European count or an international businessman. He never pushed his marks. Instead, he let them come to him, drawn by his quiet confidence and the aura of exclusive wealth he projected. His early scams were brilliant in their simplicity, relying entirely on his victims' desire to get something for nothing. He would casually mention a money-printing box he had invented, a complex-looking mahogany contraption filled with brass dials and rollers. He would demonstrate the box to a greedy mark, inserting a blank piece of paper, and 6 hours later, producing a flawless, crisp $100 bill. Lustig would explain that the process was slow due to the chemicals required, but it guaranteed a steady stream of perfect, untraceable currency. The victim, blinded by the prospect of endless wealth, would beg Lustig to sell them the machine, often paying upwards of $30,000 for it. Lustig would pack the machine with 2 more genuine $100 bills, which would emerge 12 hours later, giving him enough time to cross an international border before the machine started printing blank paper. By the early 1920s, Lustig had perfected his craft, becoming a master manipulator who knew exactly how to find the psychological weakness in any individual. He understood that a successful con wasn't about stealing money. It was about selling a story so intoxicating that the victim desperately wanted it to be true. But the ocean liner scams, while profitable, were small change compared to the ambition that burned inside Victor Lustig. He wanted a masterpiece, a con so audacious, so historically massive, that his name would be whispered with a mixture of horror and awe for generations. The opportunity for this masterpiece presented itself in May 1925, shortly after Lustig arrived in Paris. The city was recovering from the devastation of World War I, and the economy was booming, creating an atmosphere of wild optimism and aggressive business expansion. One morning, while sitting in a Parisian cafe, reading a newspaper and sipping a perfect espresso, a small article caught Lustig's attention. The article discussed the deteriorating condition of the Eiffel Tower, noting that the city was struggling with the astronomical costs of painting and maintaining the massive iron structure. It's crucial to remember that in 1925, the Eiffel Tower was not the universally beloved symbol of Paris that it is today. When it was built for the 1889 World's Fair, it was only meant to stand for 20 years before being dismantled, and many Parisians considered it a massive, ugly eyesore. The newspaper article casually mentioned that public opinion was divided, and some government officials had even suggested that it might be cheaper to tear the tower down entirely rather than continue paying for its upkeep. For Victor Lustig, that single sentence wasn't just news. It was the blueprint for the greatest confidence trick in human history. Within hours, Lustig had formulated a plan of breathtaking audacity, a scheme that required absolute perfection in its execution. He was going to pose as a high-ranking French government official and sell the Eiffel Tower as scrap metal to the highest bidder. The first step was establishing his credibility, creating a facade so flawless that no one would dare question his authority. Lustig hired a master forger to produce incredibly detailed, official-looking government stationery bearing the seal of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. With his forged credentials in hand, he sent letters to the 6 largest scrap metal dealers in Paris, men who controlled massive industrial empires. The letters were stamped confidential and invited the dealers to a highly secretive meeting at the Hotel de Crillon, one of the most luxurious and exclusive hotels in the city. Lustig had booked the most expensive suite in the hotel, transforming it into a makeshift government office that radiated power and discretion. When the 6 scrap metal barons arrived, they were met by a man who looked and acted exactly like a powerful, slightly overworked bureaucrat. Lustig introduced himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, speaking in hushed, serious tones about a matter of national importance. He explained that due to the crippling maintenance costs and the structural issues of the Eiffel Tower, the French government had made a difficult, highly controversial decision. The tower, he told them, looking each man directly in the eye, was to be dismantled, and the 7,000 tons of iron were to be sold for scrap. Because this decision would cause a massive public outcry, the government required absolute secrecy until the demolition was officially announced, which is why they were meeting in a hotel rather than a ministry office. He painted a picture of bureaucratic necessity, speaking of engineering reports, budgetary constraints, and the inevitable progress of the modern city. The scrap metal dealers, sitting in the luxurious suite, listening to this impeccably dressed official, didn't suspect a thing. Lustig had set the hook perfectly, and now it was time to let the fish run with the line. He concluded the meeting at the Hotel de Crillon by taking the 6 scrap metal dealers on a private tour of the Eiffel Tower, arriving in a rented limousine to complete the illusion of wealth and power. As they walked around the base of the massive iron structure, Lustig flashed his forged credentials to the ticket takers, gaining immediate VIP access. The guards, assuming he was exactly who he claimed to be, let the group pass without a second glance, cementing his authority in the minds of his victims. While the dealers evaluated the sheer volume of metal above them, calculating their potential profits, Lustig observed them closely. He wasn't just showing them the merchandise. He was studying their body language, their questions, and their interactions, looking for the perfect mark. He needed someone who was greedy enough to bite, ambitious enough to want the prestige of dismantling the tower, but insecure enough to be manipulated. Out of the 6 men, one stood out immediately: André Poisson, a dealer from the provinces who was desperate to make a name for himself among the Parisian elite. Poisson was a wealthy man, but he lacked the social standing and connections of his competitors, making him incredibly anxious to secure this massive government contract. He asked too many questions, sweat nervously in his expensive suit, and constantly sought Lustig's approval, revealing a deep-seated insecurity that the con artist immediately recognized as a goldmine. After the tour, Lustig instructed the dealers to submit their sealed bids within 24 hours, stressing again the absolute necessity of total secrecy. If the press or the public caught wind of the demolition, the government would be forced to cancel the project, and the dealers would lose the opportunity of a lifetime. When the bids arrived the next day, Lustig didn't even bother opening most of them. He already knew exactly who he was going to choose. He contacted André Poisson privately, informing the anxious dealer that his bid had been successful and that the contract was his. Poisson was overjoyed, envisioning the immense wealth and respect he would command once he became the man who bought the Eiffel Tower. But as they sat down in the luxurious suite at the Hotel de Crillon to finalize the details, a sudden wave of suspicion washed over the scrap metal dealer. Something about the entire arrangement felt slightly off, a nagging doubt in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite articulate. Why was everything happening so quickly? Why the extreme secrecy? Why was this massive transaction taking place in a hotel room instead of a government building? Poisson's wife had been questioning the deal from the start, warning her husband that the government didn't usually operate this way. As Poisson hesitated, his hand hovering over the final contract, Lustig realized that his masterpiece was on the verge of collapsing. This is the moment where an amateur con artist would have panicked, pushed too hard, or tried to reassure the mark with aggressive promises. But Victor Lustig was a master, and he understood that the best way to eliminate suspicion wasn't to deny it, but to confirm it in a way that benefited him. Lustig leaned across the desk, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, his demeanor shifting from an authoritative bureaucrat to a vulnerable, struggling civil servant. He confessed to Poisson that his salary as a deputy director general was barely enough to maintain the lifestyle required of his position. He explained that entertaining clients, hosting dinners, and dressing the part were incredibly expensive, and he was struggling to keep up appearances. He dropped a heavy hint, implying that if Poisson wanted the contract to go through smoothly, a small, discreet contribution to Lustig's personal finances would be necessary. In other words, Lustig asked for a bribe. And the brilliance of this maneuver was absolute perfection. For André Poisson, this changed everything. He was a businessman who understood how the world worked. Corrupt government officials demanding bribes were a familiar, comforting reality. The fact that Lustig wanted a bribe didn't make him suspicious. It made him authentic. Any lingering doubts Poisson had vanished instantly, replaced by the reassuring certainty that he was dealing with a standard, corrupt Parisian bureaucrat. Poisson smiled, reached into his briefcase, and handed Lustig a massive sum of cash, not just for the Eiffel Tower, but for the bribe as well. Lustig accepted the money with a slight, practiced bow, handed over the forged bill of sale, and watched the scrap metal dealer walk out the door. Believing he owned the Eiffel Tower, within an hour, Lustig and his accomplice had packed their bags, checked out of the Hotel de Krillin, and boarded a train bound for Vienna. They sat in their first-class cabin, sipping champagne and counting a fortune in cash, laughing at the audacity of what they had just accomplished. Lustig knew that eventually, Poisson would show up at the tower with a crew of demolition workers and a forged piece of paper, only to discover the devastating truth. But Lustig also knew something else, something far more profound about human psychology and the nature of pride. He spent the next month in Vienna, reading the Parisian newspapers every single day, waiting for the massive scandal to break, waiting for his face to be plastered across the front pages. But the story never broke. The police were never called, the fraud was never reported, and André Poisson's name never appeared in the press. Lustig had gambled correctly on the most powerful human emotion of all, profound, paralyzing humiliation. Poisson was so utterly embarrassed by the magnitude of his foolishness, so terrified of becoming the laughingstock of the entire country, that he simply absorbed the massive financial loss in silence. He couldn't bear the thought of his competitors, his wife, and the Parisian elite knowing that he had been stupid enough to buy the Eiffel Tower from a man in a hotel room. And so, the greatest con in history remained a total secret, known only to the victim and the man who had robbed him. For a few months, Lustig lived like a king in Austria, spending Poisson's money on tailored suits, fine dining, and beautiful women. But the thrill of the con, the adrenaline rush of pulling off the impossible, was far more addictive than the money itself. The fact that Poisson hadn't reported the crime planted a dangerous, incredibly ambitious idea in Victor Lustig's mind. If he had sold the Eiffel Tower once without anyone finding out, what was stopping him from going back to Paris and doing it again? In an act of supreme arrogance and unparalleled confidence, Lustig packed his bags and boarded a train heading back to the scene of the crime. He was going to attempt the impossible, a repeat performance of a masterpiece, trusting that the lightning of human greed would strike twice in the same place. A few months after fleeing Paris with a fortune in his briefcase, Victor Lustig stepped back off a train at the Gare du Nord, completely undeterred by the astronomical risks he was taking. He was returning to the exact city where he had committed the greatest fraud in history, convinced that his own brilliance would protect him once again. Lustig re-established his operation exactly as he had the first time, checking into the Hotel de Krillin, renting the same luxurious suite, and printing a new batch of forged government stationery. He even used the same fake identity, the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. This time, however, he targeted a completely different group of scrap metal dealers, ensuring that there was no overlap with his previous victims. He sent out the confidential invitations, hosted the secretive meetings, and pitched the exact same story. The Eiffel Tower was too expensive to maintain and had to be sold for scrap. The sheer arrogance of the plan was staggering. He was running an identical con in the same hotel, trusting that lightning would strike twice. But Lustig was a gambler, and the thrill of the danger was just as intoxicating to him as the money he planned to steal. He took the new group of dealers on the same VIP tour of the tower, flashing his fake credentials, and once again, he identified the perfect mark. He found another ambitious, slightly insecure businessman who was desperate for the prestige of the contract and willing to bend the rules to get it. The process unfolded with terrifying precision. The bids were submitted, the winner was chosen, and the final meeting was arranged in a hotel suite. Lustig played his part flawlessly, introducing the subtle request for a bribe to authenticate his role as a corrupt bureaucrat. The new mark seemed just as eager as Andre Poisson had been, ready to hand over a massive sum of cash to secure the Eiffel Tower. But this time, something was different. The new victim wasn't quite as paralyzed by his own ambition, and a seed of genuine suspicion had taken root in his mind. Before bringing the cash to the final meeting, the dealer decided to verify Lustig's identity, making a discreet inquiry with the actual Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He didn't mention the Eiffel Tower, but simply asked if there was a Deputy Director General by the name Lustig was using, operating out of the Hotel de Crillon. The real government officials were entirely baffled. They had no idea who this man was, and they certainly weren't conducting official business from a luxury hotel. The police were immediately notified, and detectives were dispatched to the Hotel de Crillon to investigate this mysterious bureaucrat. But Victor Lustig was not just a master manipulator. He possessed an almost supernatural sixth sense for danger. He had spent his entire life reading people, and as he sat in his hotel suite waiting for the mark to arrive with the money, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was a look from the hotel concierge or a lingering glance from a man in the lobby. But Lustig knew instantly that the trap had been sprung. He didn't wait to confirm his suspicions. Within minutes, he had packed his bags, abandoned the con, and slipped out a side exit of the hotel. By the time the Parisian police knocked on the door of his suite, Lustig and his accomplice were already in a taxi, speeding toward the train station. They managed to board a train leaving France just as the detectives were searching their empty room, escaping by the narrowest of margins. Lustig had failed to sell the Eiffel Tower a second time, but the fact that he had even attempted it and escaped without being caught only added to his legend. He fled to the United States, where he continued his career as a master con artist, pulling off elaborate schemes that targeted some of the most dangerous men in America. His most famous American con involved Al Capone, the most powerful and ruthless gangster in the country, a man who regularly murdered anyone who crossed him. Lustig approached Capone with a proposition. If Capone gave him $50,000, Lustig promised to double it within 2 months through a complex stock scheme. Capone, intrigued by Lustig's aristocratic charm and supreme confidence, handed over the money, warning him of the severe consequences if he failed. Lustig took the $50,000, locked it in a safe deposit box in a bank, and did absolutely nothing with it for exactly 2 months. When the time was up, Lustig returned to Capone, looking defeated and exhausted, apologizing profusely that the stock scheme had failed completely. Capone, furious and preparing to exact violent revenge, watched in absolute shock as Lustig reached into his coat and handed back the entire $50,000. Lustig explained that while he had failed to double the money, he wasn't a thief, and he was returning the original investment because he valued his honor. Capone was so stunned by this apparent display of incredible honesty from a man he assumed was a crook that he immediately handed Lustig $5,000 as a reward. Lustig had conned the most dangerous man in America without stealing a dime. He had simply recognized that Capone, surrounded by thieves and murderers, would pay handsomely for a display of integrity. This was the genius of Victor Lustig. He didn't just steal money. He manipulated the fundamental psychology of every person he met. Lustig's career finally came to an end in 1935, not because of a grand con, but because of a massive counterfeiting operation he had established in America. He had flooded the country with millions of dollars in fake currency, creating bills so perfect that even bank tellers couldn't distinguish them from the real thing. The Secret Service eventually tracked him down, arresting him in New York City, bringing the reign of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower to a close. Even after his arrest, Lustig managed to escape from the supposedly inescapable federal detention headquarters in Manhattan, lowering himself from a window using a rope made of bedsheets. He was recaptured a month later in Pittsburgh and sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz, the most secure prison in the United States. He spent his final years behind bars, a sophisticated European gentleman surrounded by violent criminals, until he died of pneumonia in 1947. When he died, the authorities found a piece of paper in his cell, a list of 10 commandments for con men that he had written out by hand. The rules included advice like, be a patient listener, never look bored, and never boast. Just let your importance be quietly obvious. Victor Lustig died in a prison hospital, a continent away from the Parisian cafes and luxury hotels where he had once orchestrated the impossible. But his legacy remains unmatched in the history of crime. He was the phantom who turned a national monument into a personal payday. He understood that people don't buy what you are selling. They buy the story you are telling, and they will pay any price if the story makes them feel important. The Eiffel Tower still stands today, a permanent, iron reminder of the man who proved that with enough confidence and a perfect suit, you can sell absolutely anything.